Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. I'm gonna take a little bit different approach, though. We work very closely in our department, the planning department, with the Department of Transportation, where Dan is, and also with Neighborhood and Business Services that Pat leads. But I'm going to talk about this a bit from a planner's perspective. So for you planners in the room, I hope this will resonate, and then for the others, if you will bear with me, I'd appreciate it. First, I want to talk a little bit about the trends that we've been seeing, and I think probably a lot of you all have looked at this, but how we say that they really reinforce the need for complete streets. And as we were really looking at a kind of a comprehensive growth framework for Charlotte a few years ago, we went back and really looked at what are the changes in demographics, what do they really mean? So as we looked first at the baby boomers, that really large group of us that is aging very quickly, we found that they're looking towards simplifying their lifestyles. I'm not going to read you all of this, but part of what this means is that for the baby boomers that are still in the workforce, they're looking at shorter commutes. And sometimes those shorter commutes may mean even quick transit commutes, walking to work, moving around differently. And they're also looking at, not all of them, but a number of shifting from more suburban locations to urban locations. We're starting to see a lot of baby boomers that are becoming empty nesters. And though the baby boomers were largely, well, not largely, but were partially responsible for building the suburbs, many of us grew up in suburbs and lived in suburbs for most of our lives, getting to the point where a lot of folks are wanting to move back into the city and are looking for a more urban lifestyle. And with a more urban lifestyle comes complete streets. Looking for access to cultural amenities, restaurants, and so forth. Again, being able to get to those places, sometimes by walking, sometimes by driving, sometimes by biking. And then finally looking for a sense of place, which is one of the things that as planners we're concerned about as we go about our daily business, is building that sense of place. And then starting to look at the Gen Xers that are certainly out there in the marketplace, again looking for more of an urban lifestyle, less likely to initially move even out into the suburbs like maybe baby boomers did, and again seeing that sense of place being important. So we're really, I think the bottom line of all this is what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is a resurgence in urban place, and urban place is all about walking and biking and moving around in something a lot of the time other than a car. And this is a study that we had done for us about 5 years ago by Robert Charles Lesser that looked at the market potential for urban environments. And you can see the large percentage of folks that prefer walking to shops, 46%. This is self-reported, probably not statistically defensible, but gives you a perspective. 54% preferring to live closer to work, 50% preferring an urban environment. So again, starting to see that resurgence of pedestrian-oriented, bicycle-oriented environments. And then we took this information, among a number of other things, and incorporated that into our very broad vision for our community called Centers, Quarters, and Wedges. This was something that was originally developed in the early 90s and was updated and adopted by our City Council in August of last year. And this is really looking at how do we, at a very broad level, focus and organize our growth, with putting the greatest amount of growth in nodal activity centers and 5 major growth corridors, and then retaining the lower density, more suburban character in our wedges. And if you see this map, I think you can get a little bit better idea of, this is probably how a lot of your cities are lay out, but these centers of activity, these growth corridors, the 5 growth corridors, and then this green area as being our wedges. And what this document does at a very high level is prioritizes street elements differently depending on the land use and design characteristics. And this, when I think of complete streets, I think we have the very simplistic way of streets that have every single element that you might ever want in them. But then sometimes complete streets are what is complete for the environment in which they're located. So a complete street in our center city or an activity center or a transit center might be very different, might be a much more dense street network, broader sidewalks, than what you might find in, say, an industrial center or an area around an interchange, where we're going to be more automobile-oriented. The completeness may be more tilted towards the automobile, but still planning to include the pedestrian and bicycle facilities. And then as we looked at our wedges, which are our traditionally suburban areas, how we increase connectivity in those areas, add bicycle and pedestrian facilities, particularly connecting our neighborhoods to the things that are most important, to transit, neighborhood serving retail, community facilities like schools and parks, and really prioritizing those elements in determining where we go first with complete streets. The way that in the planning department we look most directly at complete streets is through our area planning or long-range planning process. And this is, Dan talked about how we did our planning 15 or so years ago, and this was pretty much it. This is the way that the planning department and the transportation department planned for pedestrians. And if you see this right here, and this little old man, he needs to run like hell to get across the street. We think that we've evolved since then, and it's been a long and slow evolution. But in starting with our centers, quarters, and wedges principles, we apply those to the smaller geographic areas. And we use these plans to identify our public and private investments, to recommend future land use, identify our transportation needs, particularly in re-looking at streets within an area, providing guidance for development design, which really couples with our streets, because we really can't look at our streets without looking at what's happening with the land use along our streets, and then recommending zoning changes in these areas. So in those plans, we start by analyzing our street network, the facilities that we have, looking at what's out there now, and you can see, probably not very well, but we've shown what facilities we have. This is for a recently adopted plan in the Elizabeth area close to town. And what we find is that some areas already have very well-connected streets. This is for one of our older neighborhoods. This is the street network that it was built with, close to 100 years ago. So some areas really start out with a great street network and fairly complete streets. And then some don't. This is a neighborhood that was probably built in the 70s or 80s when we were really excited about cul-de-sacs. And you really couldn't get from here to here without going out here. So you can see the difference in what we're starting with when we're doing our area plans, and we have to take that into account. And we also find as we do these plans that some areas really have complete streets. Frankly, a lot of this, particularly with respect to bicycle facilities, is through recent work that's been done, because we did not have bike lanes in Charlotte.
We didn't have any bike lanes in 2001.
In 2001, so in 10 years, Dan could probably tell you the statistics on how many bike lanes we've added, but we have, you can see, done a fair amount of work. These are different areas where we've really focused in that time period on more complete streets. And yet we still have a lot of streets like these. And in particular, I like the one in the bottom left-hand corner. It looks like it would really be a really nice, pretty place to walk, until you got to the light pole that someone very thoughtfully put right in the middle of the sidewalk. So we have a range of conditions, and actually some of these conditions are in the same neighborhoods as the previous slides. So we might have a range of, part of an area may have really great streets, and part of an area may have really not so good streets that we're still struggling with. So regardless of what we start out with, we really think that creation of complete streets is an important part of what we do in the planning process. So we're looking at new street connections, updated cross sections, and we do for our thoroughfares, and even for sometimes for our minor streets, go into our plans, our area plans, and develop specific cross sections, either for new streets that we're looking at having built in those areas, or for retrofitting, a lot of retrofitting these days of our existing streets. We look at intersection enhancements, and we look at the capital improvements that it'll take to take this vision from a vision to actual reality. And I think one thing worth mentioning in the way that we have evolved into doing our area plans in Charlotte is that this is a multidisciplinary effort. The Department of Transportation is every bit as involved, and sometimes more so, in the development of these plans as the planning department is. And on some of the plans, we actually take them forward jointly as being planning department and Department of Transportation plans. And that's probably one major, major change from what we might have done 15, 20 years ago. As I mentioned, we do include cross-sections in our plans, and I know that while you can't read this, I can tell you that these are pedestrians, and this is a bicyclist, and this is from, again, the Elizabeth plan that I talked about a little bit earlier, and we start out with actually streets where we have the different types of cross-sections denoted on a master map, and then for each of the different types of cross-sections, we do develop that cross-section. And we use that as guidance for our urban zoning districts, that actually this sets an ultimate curb line, and we measure our building setbacks off of that ultimate curb line. So we're getting to a much greater level of detail than, and even moving into the regulatory realm, very different from what we might have done, from what we actually did 10 years ago. Again, the relationship between buildings and parking areas is also a key component of our area plans, particularly that relationship between those and streets. And I think we've tried to be really very realistic about, at a main street level, we're going to be very pedestrian oriented. We're going to expect the buildings to come to the back of the sidewalk, and we're in our plans going to design that way, and we're going to set up our zoning that way. And that we have also some very automobile-oriented areas where we're still going to provide those facilities, but the way the pieces all fit together may be very different. And so as you can see, some streets are designed for pedestrian and bicycle activity. Buildings are moved up to the street. And then in other situations, it's a more automobile-oriented environment. We still have the bike facilities, we still have the pedestrian facilities, but the arrangement of the land use and the parking is different. We also get into, sometimes in our plans, recommendations for capital improvements and some fairly specific recommendations. This is for the Plaza Central Business District, and this is actually a thoroughfare that runs through the district. This is an area a couple of miles from where we are now. And this is a local street, and this is a local street, and another local street that's part of this business district. And on the left is the environment that you have now. And so you can see you can just barely see the curb line with a lot of pull-in parking. Further down the street, again, no curb line even, with pull-in parking. And this is the concept that the plan called for, which is back-end angle parking with sidewalk up along the building. So in the future, we'd have sidewalk running here, back-end angle parking, and then bicycle facilities and vehicular facilities in the street. And this is a rendering, Photoshop rendering, of what the street could look like. One thing I learned as I looked at this late last week is that it's really important what your renderings look like. And I started to understand maybe why we might have had a little bit of a struggle in working with the businesses out there, because it's hard to see the difference. But I'm going to show you because I had to look closely. We're taking this very wide street down to a much narrower street. We have back-end angle parking, and then the sidewalks back here where you can see previously you got to kind of walk along this little edge of the street, and not many people chose to, even though this is a very pedestrian-oriented area on other streets. And then the sidewalk back here, you could dodge the cars that might be pulling in here. And so this in the future with the sidewalks back along the businesses will be a much more pedestrian-friendly area. It is actually in design right now, very close to going to construction. We've just finished up buying real estate. So a few final thoughts on being a planner and working with complete streets is that this is something that you need buy-in from multiple parties. I can remember early days with the planning department and a lot of tense, and that would be saying it nicely, very tense conversation with the engineers and the Department of Transportation, because we had some forward-thinking planners in the department that were really advocating for this approach. And it's really great to now be in an environment where I think we are all aiming for the same thing and we have the buy-in from the multiple parties. Nonetheless, I think as Dan pointed out, you're going to have some people who still, that's not the kind of city that they planned on, and they would like to drive in their car everywhere all the time. And we have to acknowledge that there are certain parts of the community that are still going to remain very automobile focused. We really think that detailed plans can be very helpful in setting the vision for complete streets, especially at a level that local citizens can understand. The type of street and the relationship between the buildings and the streets needs to be considered. Not every street is going to have buildings right at the back of the sidewalk. And I think that's one thing that a lot of our planners as we started to make this shift, had a real difficulty understanding that different kinds of streets are going to have different building locations. And finally, planning for complete streets really is not of much value unless you have a way to implement those streets. So programs that we've been very blessed to have that have gone in and retrofitted in a lot of areas, ordinances that will help us move towards complete streets and build different kinds of streets from the beginning are really important.